Hello, Misfits. This is Kevin. Welcome to Horrorwood. So, Misfits, this is a really strange thing because it is just me today. I'm at Kate's, I'm in the Horrorwood headquarters, and I'm on the microphone, and I'm looking across from me, and there's no Kate. Kate will not be on this recording today because she unfortunately has pneumonia and is very, very sick right now, which is awful. But she's on the mend and we hope she gets better soon. She's actually downstairs right now, just relaxing and getting better. So I'm up here to tell you a story. It's funny I say that because I remember when I was in college, I was in a production of Winnie the Pooh, and one of my lines, my opening lines, I was the narrator, by the way. I wasn't on stage. All you heard was my voice, much like right now. But my first line in the play was, "Let me tell you a story." I don't know why that just came back to me, but we'll get into the story in just a few minutes. To start off, I want to say a huge thank you to our new Patronian, Misfit Murderino, Sherry. Welcome. We love you. Thank you for the support. Kate said thank you before she left to go, be on the mend. We're so happy to have you. Thank you for supporting the podcast. And we absolutely love you. We could not do this without you. So I want to say that we've also been getting your stories. Misfits, you've been writing into us. Thank you so much for doing that. We love hearing from you. We love hearing your stories and your tales. Please continue to do that. The previous topics that we've thrown out there, the first one was, have you ever had a strange coincidence or encounter around the death of a loved one? Whether that's a sign or maybe something happened that made you think of them. I told the story last time about when my mom's cousin passed away and we heard a disembodied voice say my mom's name on the night of his death. Anything like that. So the second topic that we threw out there was, have you ever had a strange experience with a friend? Have you ever been playing with a Ouija board at a sleepover? Or have you been out ghost hunting and encountered something with your friend? I don't know. Have you been to a haunted house on Halloween with friends and something creepy and strange happened? And then for another topic we want to throw out there, have you ever lived in a haunted house? I have, and I've told this story before. Just a quick refresher. When I was a kid, my family and I lived in an old house. It was an old colonial house in Parkersburg, West Virginia. And that shit was haunted as fuck. There was an old lady ghost, there were shadows, there was a mist. It was all kinds of crazy shit. And I was so scared to sleep by myself in my room. I would always try to go and sleep in my parents' room, and eventually they were like, stop it. So I just had to face the demons and the old lady ghost. I'm fine today. It's great. So that is the topic for this week. Have you ever lived in a haunted house? Are you a believer in ghosts? Is there anything that happened to you in said house that made you a believer? Tell us all about it. We want to hear everything. Keep those stories coming, Misfits. We love them, and we love you. Okay, so I love a horror movie. I love a cursed film. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. Well, I'm going to be talking about today. So my story this week is about the movie The Crow and the death of Brandon Lee. To really understand Brandon Lee, you have to start with the parents, naturally, right? His dad was famed martial arts movie star Bruce Lee. Bruce was born in 1940 and grew up going between Hong Kong and the United States. By the late 1960s, he had become obsessed with two things: redefining martial arts and breaking into the film industry. Before the movies, though, Bruce was actually a teacher. In Seattle, while studying philosophy at the University of Washington, he began teaching martial arts to anyone willing to learn, regardless of race, which at this time in the 60s was pretty controversial. And it's in Seattle where he met Linda Emery, who would later become Linda Lee Caldwell. Linda was a student at the university, and Bruce was teaching martial arts classes on campus. She wasn't dazzled by him. I mean, we think of Bruce Lee as this big movie star, but when they met, he absolutely wasn't one yet. But she really fell for him. She loved his intensity, his intelligence, and his confidence. They fell in love and got married in 1964 at a time when interracial marriages were still met with resistance. Their relationship was built on a mutual respect and a belief that Bruce's vision was worth fighting for. So here you have two people who meet in college. Bruce Lee is Asian, Linda Lee Caldwell is white, and there's this, it's the 1960s. People are still trying to figure out how they feel about interracial relationships. Spoiler, they're totally fine. This was a really ridiculous period of time in history. I mean, it still happens. I don't want to get too far into it, but let's just say the odds weren't necessarily stacked in their favor at this time. So then, of course, here comes Brandon Lee, their son. He's born on February 1st, 1965 in Oakland, California. Bruce at this time is kind of struggling to find his place in Hollywood, but that struggle doesn't last that long. By the early 1970s, Bruce had become a phenomenon in Hong Kong cinema, starring in The Big Boss, Fist of Fury, and Way of the Dragon. The family moved to Hong Kong around 1970, and Brandon spent some of his earliest formative years there, speaking Cantonese fluently and watching his father work. That's amazing. But everything changed again in 1973. While preparing for the release of his movie Enter the Dragon, Bruce Lee died suddenly on July 20th, 1973 in Hong Kong. He was just 32 years old. That's so young, and especially, having this blossoming career. He has a child. I will say that they do have another child, a daughter. I'll talk about her in a little bit. But the official cause of death was cerebral edema, which is swelling of the brain. This was triggered by a reaction to a painkiller he took for a headache. I can't even imagine. So because Bruce was so physically disciplined and seemingly invincible, this explanation completely shocks everybody. And people really couldn't accept it to begin with. They were like, what the fuck? This doesn't seem right. He had an allergic reaction to a painkiller. And so then the rumors start. People are like, okay, so this isn't real. This is not what happened. So let's make up some shit around it because we don't believe it. So you hear things like, oh, there was a gang involved. He was poisoned. There's mysterious martial arts lore that, caused him to die this way. But multiple investigations concluded it was a tragic medical reaction. And that's just the truth of it. So for his son Brandon, the loss is devastating. He was only 8 years old at this time. Linda later described him as deeply wounded by the loss. He was so upset by it. Martial arts, which had once been a bond between father and son, became a painful reminder of his father. After Bruce's death, Linda moved Brandon and his younger sister Shannon Lee, there she is, Shannon Lee, back to the United States, first to Seattle. Remember that Linda and Bruce had met in Seattle, so they had a history there. And this is where Bruce would eventually be buried, in Seattle. After a sort of a brief stint in Seattle, the family moves to Los Angeles. Growing up, Brandon carried his father's name everywhere, whether he wanted to or not. There was this weird expectation of him to be Bruce reborn, but he was just a kid. Like, his father had such an intense legacy. I think, fans and everybody around him was kind of like, well, Brandon's into martial arts and he will be the one to carry on his father's legacy. But he's just a kid at this time. I don't think you can really expect that from a child. But Brandon was bright. He was curious, rebellious, sometimes just a little bit reckless. He trained in martial arts again as a teenager under Dan Inosanto, who was one of Bruce's closest students. Training in rooms lined with photos of his father made it hard to claim the art as his own, and for a time, Brandon just stepped away from martial arts completely. I think he kept going back to it because he loved it so much, but then he has, this connection to his father through this because that was their bond, was their love of martial arts. So I can understand how that would be extremely painful. What ultimately grounded Brandon wasn't martial arts, it was acting. Brandon realized in high school that he didn't just inherit physical ability, he had a genuine love for storytelling. And after being expelled from Chadwick School in 1983, he finished his education through Miralest High School, then committed himself to acting. He studied theater at Emerson College in Boston, ended up performing on the stage. And he later trained extensively with respected acting teachers, including Eric Morris and the Lee Strasberg Theater and Film Institute. I mean, that's pretty amazing. He really latches on to the arts and a love for performing and acting, and he finds his niche. So that's awesome. By the time Brandon returned to Los Angeles in the mid-1980s, he was building his own foundation for a career in Hollywood. He worked as a script reader, studied constantly, and took acting seriously in a way that surprised people who assumed he was just another, martial artist's son, which is an awful thing to think. Okay, so here comes a big break for Brandon. Casting director Lynn Stallmaster offered him an audition for Kung Fu the movie. Brandon was like, come on. I'm not trying to be my dad. I don't know. I don't think I should. But he was like, okay, I'm gonna do this role because I think this is gonna be my way in. And he was absolutely right. He gets the part. He goes to film. On that set, he reconnected with Jeff Imada, who worked in stunts and would later become one of Brandon's closest collaborators. These two was thick as thieves. The TV movie aired on February 1st, 1986, which also happened to be Brandon's birthday, and it was his first credited screen role. That same year, Brandon took a much bigger leap by going to Hong Kong to star in his first feature film. And I say feature film because remember, the Kung Fu the movie was a TV movie. So then he's like, okay, I'm going to be in the films. I'm going to be in the movies. Get me on that big screen. So he goes to Hong Kong and he stars in the film Legacy of Rage. This movie is directed by Ronnie Yu. This movie was a serious test for Brandon. The film was shot in Cantonese. It was his only Hong Kong production, and the working relationship between actor and director was reportedly tense. Still, Brandon carried the movie as the lead, playing a man framed for a crime he didn't commit. The film found success overseas, actually, especially in Japan, and it even screened at Cannes the following year. Brandon was nominated for a Hong Kong Film Award for Best New Performer. So this kid is coming up, y'all. He is getting parts, he's in movies. Love. In 1987, Brandon returned to American television for Kung Fu The Next Generation, which was a TV series. And he was going to be playing a descendant of the original character of that series. The pilot aired on CBS Summer Playhouse, which was a slot known for testing unsold shows. Audiences hated it. They're like, next, we're bored, we don't want it. So the series didn't get picked up. And Brandon took it as a reminder that name recognition did not guarantee momentum. But Brandon keeps working. In 1988, he appears in an episode of O'Hara, starring Pat Morita, where Brandon played a villain connected to the Yakuza. And people close to him warned him that the role could reinforce stereotypes, but Brandon takes it anyway because he wanted to stretch himself and avoid being seen as this like one-note performer. Then came Laser Mission, released in 1990. It was filmed in Namibia and cast Brandon as a mercenary in a Cold War era action plot. Critics didn't love this one, but the movie performed well on home video, which mattered at the time, and it helped Brandon build his audience. By this point, Brandon had returned to martial arts training in a more intentional way, again working closely with Dan Inosanto, and he often filmed his training sessions to see what movements looked honest and good on camera, which is pretty smart. He wasn't interested in tournament fighting. He wanted martial arts to serve character and story. In 1991, Brandon made his official Hollywood feature debut in Showdown in Little Tokyo opposite Dolph Lundgren. The film was produced by Warner Brothers and released in August of 1991. It didn't do well critically or commercially at first, but later found a cult following. For Brandon, it was important because it put him on the studio radar. Around this time, he was also briefly considered to play his father in Dragon, the Bruce Lee story. But he turned it down. But I fully understand him not wanting to portray his dad. He felt uncomfortable portraying Bruce and especially uneasy about dramatizing his parents' relationship. Weird. The role went to Jason Scott Lee, who later said Brandon encouraged him to treat Bruce as a flawed human being, not a myth, which I think is a really beautiful thing to say. Brandon's real momentum shift happened with Rapid Fire, which was released in 1992 by 20th Century Fox. The project came together because Robert Lawrence saw potential in Brandon after watching his earlier work. Brandon didn't just star in the film, he actually helped put it together. He worked on the story. He contributed to the fight choreography alongside Jeff Amata, and made sure the character wasn't just like a standard action hero. The movie opened strong at the box office, and while critics were mixed, many singled Brandon out as charismatic and watchable. So yeah, the movie does well. It gets mixed reviews, but people are like, hey, this Brandon Lee, he's pretty cool. More importantly, this film led Brandon to signing a multi-picture deal with Fox and another with Carolco Pictures. By late 1992, Brandon was doing press for Rapid Fire when the script for a movie called The Crow came his way. The project was different from anything that he'd ever done. It was dark, it was emotional, it was about grief. Director Alex Proyas and producer Jeff Most saw in Brandon someone who could bring both physicality and vulnerability to the lead role of Eric Draven. Brandon responded immediately to the material, especially to the themes of love, loss, and justice. He began offering thoughtful notes on dialogue and character rhythm, and started imagining how to strip away conventional martial arts movement in favor of something more raw. So The Crow starts long before cameras ever rolled, and the origin of the story is honestly inseparable from the theme of grief. James O'Barr created the comic in the late 1980s after losing his fiancée in a drunk driving accident. Writing it was his only way of surviving that loss. It isn't a superhero tale in the traditional sense. It's about love interrupted and the idea that something unfinished refuses to stay buried. When the comic began circulating, it stood out immediately. People were like, this is kind of different and we like it. In 1989, producer Jeff Most discovered the comic in a shop in Los Angeles and became obsessed with the idea of turning it into a movie. He reached out to O'Barr directly and convinced him that the movie shouldn't be softened or turned into something commercial. There were early studio conversations that went nowhere, including one that imagined the story as a musical. I don't know, which tells you how misunderstood the material initially was. O'Barr ultimately chose to work with Most, turning down a significant offer elsewhere because he trusted the vision. Most teamed up with Remember Most is the name of the producer. He teamed up with writer John Shirley, and the two developed multiple treatments before the script evolved into something closer to what the final film is. Later, David J. Shao was brought in to help refine the screenplay. Finding the right director for this project was crucial. Most and his producing partner, Ed Pressman, were drawn to filmmakers from the music video world because the story demanded a strong visual. Which makes sense coming from a comic. Like, that's a visual art medium. So, like, of course. That search led them to Alex Proyas, an Australian director. Proyas leaned hard into atmosphere and mood, pulling from noir and expressionist cinema, the kind of visuals that feel almost mythic. By the early 1990s, Paramount Pictures had stepped in as distributor, with an initial plan for release in 1993. Casting the lead took some time. Names like Christian Slater and River Phoenix were talked about, but it was Brandon Lee who ultimately wins everybody over. O'Barr initially had doubts, but once he met Brandon and saw how deeply he understood the character, that hesitation just went away. Brandon committed fully. He dropped weight to match the character's gaunt appearance. He worked closely with Jeff Imada on action choreography, and even pushed to remove a subplot he felt leaned too far into stereotypes. He wasn't interested in playing a martial arts hero. He wanted Eric Draven to move like a musician who'd been given power, not trained for combat. Big difference. So let's talk about the story itself. I've given a brief overview, but let's talk about what The Crow is actually about. The story itself is set in a decaying version of Detroit, opening on Devil's Night, the evening before Halloween. Without spoiling too much, we know the story follows Eric Draven, who is a rock musician who is murdered alongside his fiancée Shelley. A year later, guided by a mysterious crow, Eric returns with a single purpose: to confront the people responsible and to set things right. The film unfolds more like a dark fable than a revenge thriller. There's a police officer, Sergeant Albrecht, who connects the living world to Eric's past, and there's a young girl named Sarah who represents what innocence looks like in a city that's lost its way. The villains aren't treated as comic book caricatures so much as symptoms of a larger, how am I trying to say this, like a larger rot in the city itself. Because remember, this is like a more rundown, darker version of Detroit, and those villains are kind of part of what that city's representation is, I think. So filming began in February 1993 in Wilmington, North Carolina, primarily at EUE Screen Gems Studios, with a schedule of just under 2 months. The budget was tight for a movie that relied heavily on stunts, rain-soaked night shoots, and elaborate sets. Much of the film was shot after dark, often in winter conditions. God, that sounds like a nightmare. Proyas worked closely with cinematographer Darius Walski to avoid bright colors almost entirely. This is a drab film, y'all. The city was designed to feel timeless and unmoored, with production designer Alex McDowell creating spaces that looked abandoned, but had purpose. Music was treated as part of the storytelling, and it wasn't an accessory. I mean, we're talking about a character who's a rock musician, so it feels like, yes, music is going to be really important to this film. The soundtrack blended alternative rock with an original score by Graham Revell. So filming starts. Things don't go great, but we'll get into that more in just a little bit. But things forge ahead until tragedy strikes near the end of filming. Unfortunately. Here's kind of where the beginning of how this movie is seen as a cursed film. It was March 31st, 1993 at EUE Screen Gems Studio in Wilmington, North Carolina. At this time, Brandon is 28 years old, and he's engaged to Eliza Hutton. From what I could find, she worked as part of that movie's crew. That night's work was scheduled late, as so much of the film was. Remember, this is like shooting at night in the winter. The scene being shot was a flashback. Eric Draven walking into his apartment and witnessing the brutal attack on his fiancée. It was meant to be one of the last scenes involving firearms, something that Brandon had told his mother the night before that he was relieved about. It doesn't sound like Brandon was super crazy about working with guns. Earlier that evening, producer Jeff Most saw Brandon pass by his office window on the Carlco lot. Brandon was wearing a white shirt and waved as he walked past. Jeff waved back, thinking nothing of it at the time, though he would later say the moment felt strangely final in hindsight. Brandon had more filming ahead of him, plans beyond this movie, and no reason to think this night was anything other than a normal work night. On set, the scene was staged carefully, or so everyone thought. Actor Michael Massey, who was playing the character of Funboy, was positioned about 15 to 20 feet away from Brandon. The weapon was a Smith & Wesson .44 Magnum revolver, being used as a prop. The shot required Massey's character to fire at Brandon as he enters the room. Brandon was supposed to react, fall backwards, and the scene would cut. Brandon was carrying a grocery bag rigged with a small squib that would burst on cue to simulate impact. When Massey pulled the trigger, the sound was way louder than expected. Brandon fell backward, but something was off. Instead of springing up when the director called cut, Brandon stayed down. At first, people thought he was continuing the performance or joking. There wasn't really visible blood right then. No one screamed, no one panicked. Yet. Jeff Imada, who was working as the stunt coordinator, was the first to sense that something is off here. When he reached Brandon, he saw that Brandon was unconscious and breathing heavily. Set medic Clyde Basie was called in. At that moment, even the medic didn't believe Brandon had been shot. Again, no one's really seeing any blood and there's no obvious wound. It was assumed Brandon had been knocked down harder than expected, or maybe he hit his head during the fall. Within minutes, Brandon's condition changed. His breathing became labored, his pulse slowed, and then it stopped. That's when the urgency hit. Brandon was rushed by ambulance to New Hanover Regional Medical Center in Wilmington. It was only at the hospital that doctors realized the severity of what had happened. Brandon had been struck in the abdomen by a projectile, which had traveled into his body and caused catastrophic internal damage. Surgeons worked for approximately 5 to 6 hours attempting to save him, but despite their efforts, the injuries were too severe. Brandon Lee was pronounced dead at 1:03 p.m. on March 31st, 1993. News spreads quickly, first through the crew, then through Wilmington, and then across the world. Many on the set had gone home believing Brandon would be fine, only to receive phone calls in the early hours of the morning telling them he was gone. Jeff Most has described being told initially that it was nothing serious, then slowly realizing that something unimaginably wrong had occurred. Cast members like Sophia Sheenas, who played Shelley, were devastated. Crew members were stunned into silence. Brandon's body was flown to Seattle, Washington, where he was buried at Lakeview Cemetery beside his father, Bruce Lee. A private funeral was held on April 3rd, 1993, attended by close family and friends. A memorial followed in Los Angeles, where colleagues and friends gathered to say goodbye. Brandon had been scheduled to marry Eliza Hutton just weeks later on April 17th, 1993. I can't even imagine. In the immediate aftermath, the Crow was shut down. People didn't know whether it would ever be finished. Director Alex Proyas was devastated and initially wanted to abandon the project altogether. Producer Jeff Most had said that the set felt hollow after that night, like the air had been knocked out of everyone all at once. At the time of Brandon's death, the film was close to completion, but not finished. He had shot the overwhelming majority of his scenes, but there were still about 3 days worth of material left, mostly transitional moments and a few connective scenes that were important to the story. The question became whether finishing the film would honor Brandon's work or exploit it. Because at this time, the producers and people involved are like, maybe we shouldn't continue with this. It doesn't feel right. But the decision ultimately came down to Brandon's family and the people who knew him best. His mother, Linda Lee Caldwell, and his fiancée, Eliza Hutton, both believed that Brandon would have wanted the film completed. He was proud of the work he had done. He believed in the story. He loved this movie. To let that disappear unfinished would have meant the world never seeing what he had given to it. With their blessing, the filmmakers made the decision to move forward. The production did pause for several weeks, and during that time, the script was carefully rewritten to avoid requiring Brandon to appear in scenes he hadn't already filmed. Writers including Wallen Green, Terry Hayes, Renee Balser, and Michael S. Chernuchin reshaped certain sequences, adding voiceover narration and reworking transitions so the story could flow without drawing attention to what's missing. The goal was subtlety, nothing flashy, nothing that would feel like a trick. To complete the remaining scenes, Brandon's stunt double, Chad Stahelski, stepped in. Stahelski was chosen not just because of physical similarity, but because he understood Brandon's movement and posture, because the two worked closely together. I mean, this is a stunt double. The filmmakers used careful camera angles, shadows, distant shots, and early digital compositing to superimpose Brandon's face where necessary. At the time, this kind of visual effects work was still relatively new, and it was done sparingly, only when absolutely required. One major creative casualty of this process was the skull cowboy character played by Michael Berryman. The character had been filmed but had not yet appeared in scenes with Brandon. Rather than attempt to integrate the role without him, the filmmakers chose to remove the character entirely. Which, that sucks for Michael Berryman. But the story was streamlined and the mythological elements were simplified to keep the focus on Eric Draven's emotional journey. So during this period, Paramount Pictures, which of course was going to be the one to distribute the film, chose to step away. Paramount was like, nope. The delays, the circumstances, and concerns about the film's violent content made them uncomfortable. The project could have stalled permanently at that point. I mean, your major distributor backs out. But Miramax Films stepped in. They acquired the distribution rights and injected additional funding, about $8 million, to allow the film to be completed properly. The final budget for this movie lands at about $23 million. Filming resumed in Wilmington, but the set was not the same. Cast and crew have described it as quieter and heavier. Every decision was weighed, nothing was rushed. When the film was finally completed, Alex Proyas dedicated it to Brandon Lee and Eliza Hutton. Brandon's death would eventually add to a larger rumor that The Crow is a cursed film. Long before that final tragedy cemented the film's reputation, people on the production already felt like something was off. From the moment the crew arrived in Wilmington in early 1993, strange and sometimes frightening things kept happening. Remember I said that Brandon was kind of I don't want to say it was the first thing to happen on this movie, but it was definitely the major thing that happened, was his death. One of the eeriest details comes right at the beginning of filming. According to people involved with the production, before they even got started, someone left a voicemail at the production office warning that bad things would happen if the movie was made. At the time, people were like, ugh, blug, this sounds like fucking nonsense. The thing you just kind of shrug off. But as things went on, yikes. So on the first day of shooting, things went wrong almost immediately. A crew member working in a cherry picker truck accidentally struck high-tension power lines. He was electrocuted, caught fire, and suffered catastrophic burns. He survived, but the injuries were life-altering and required years of surgery. That alone would have been enough to rattle any set. But it didn't end there. That same day, another crew member was involved in a serious traffic accident, and a fire broke out in an equipment truck. Then a powerful storm tore through the filming area and destroyed parts of the backlot sets that had been carefully built. Other incidents followed. A construction worker drove a screwdriver through their own hand. Ouch! A sculptor crashed into a workshop during an outburst of rage. That's me. People just kept getting hurt. None of these incidents were really like connected to each other, but the sheer number of them began to feel statistically absurd. All of this is happening while the film was being shot almost entirely at night, in winter, often in freezing rain. Nightmare. Cast and crew were tired. They were so tired. Some got sick with the flu, and of course, they're under constant schedule pressure, which only added to the sense that the production was running on fumes. Everybody's getting exhausted. Even producer Jeff Most, who pushed back against the idea of a literal curse, admitted that looking back, he understood why people framed it that way. Too many things went wrong for it to feel like coincidence. Adding to the unease was the timing of media attention. Hours before the fatal night, a magazine article was preparing to run stories about the unusual number of accidents on the set. When asked for comment, a production coordinator reportedly dismissed concerns by saying that yes, there had been accidents, but no one had died. Within hours, that statement became unbearably ironic. After everything that followed, people began to look backward. They reinterpreted every single incident as a warning sign. The voicemail, electrocution, destroyed sets, constant injuries, exhaustion. Even the fact that the film centered on death, resurrection, and unfinished business seemed to feed the narrative that this movie is fucking cursed. Years later, when the story was revisited in documentaries like Cursed Films on Shudder, shout out, go watch it, love it, the focus wasn't on supernatural focuses so much as accumulation. One accident can happen anywhere, two can be bad luck. But when dozens of things go wrong across a short period of time, people start searching for meaning. We talk about this a lot here at Horrorwood. Less curse, more creating an environment for things to go wrong in. You know what I mean? As I look over at an empty couch. Do you know what I mean, Kate? We're communicating telepathically. She said, yeah, no, I get that. We've talked. So after Brandon Lee died on March 31st, 1993, everything shifted into a different gear almost immediately. The film set became a crime scene. Within hours, local law enforcement was involved, trying to understand how something that was supposed to be controlled and safe had gone so wrong. The Wilmington Police Department took the lead on this, with detectives Rodney Simmons and Brian Pettis assigned to reconstruct exactly what happened. From the beginning, there was confusion. The weapon used was a real Smith & Wesson .44 Magnum revolver, but it was believed to be loaded only with blanks. Believed? That's in itself a crazy statement. Yet Brandon had suffered a penetrating wound to the abdomen, something that simply shouldn't have been possible under standard film safety practices. As detectives began interviewing crew members, a troubling picture emerged. Investigators learned that weeks earlier, during the filming of a pawn shop scene, live .44 Magnum rounds had been brought onto the set as props. What? The ammunition had reportedly been purchased locally at a pawn shop in Wilmington as part of dressing the set. This alone violated basic film safety rules. Live ammunition should never have been anywhere near a production. At some point, members of the special effects or props department decided to create their own dummy rounds instead of ordering professional ones. To do this, they pulled the bullets from live cartridges and dumped out the gunpowder. But critically, they did not remove or deactivate the primer, which is the explosive component struck by the firing pin. The bullet tips were then reinserted, creating rounds that looked inert but still contained enough explosive force to be dangerous. During a close-up shot filmed roughly 2 weeks before Brandon's death, one of these homemade dummy rounds was placed into the revolver. Witnesses later recalled hearing a popping sound when the gun was handled. That sound, investigators concluded, was the primer firing. With no gunpowder behind it, the primer still had enough force to dislodge the bullet from the casing and lodge it part way down the barrel. Nobody noticed that. Nobody noticed that part of that little bullet was in the barrel of the gun. I don't want to say little bullet, but that piece of it. The gun was not properly inspected. The bullet remained trapped inside the barrel, invisible unless someone physically checked it. 14 days later, on the night of March 31st, that same revolver was used again, this time loaded with blank rounds, which contained powder and primer, but no bullet. The film's designated weapons expert had been sent home early, and responsibility for the gun fell to a prop assistant who did not perform the required barrel check. When the blank was fired during the scene with Brandon Lee, the explosive force propelled the lodged bullet out of the barrel at near lethal velocity. That was the projectile that struck Brandon. Ballistics testing confirmed this sequence. The bullet recovered from Brandon's body matched the type of ammunition brought onto the set weeks earlier. Investigators ran dozens of forensic tests. They examined the weapon repeatedly and reconstructed the firing conditions. Nothing pointed to tampering or malicious intent. What it pointed to was negligence. After nearly a month of investigation, North Carolina District Attorney Jerry Spivey held a press conference on April 27, 1993. He announced that Brandon Lee's death was the result of crew negligence, not foul play. Spivey explained that while safety protocols had clearly been violated, the responsibility was shared across multiple individuals and departments. Because no single act rose to the level required for criminal prosecution, his office would not file charges against the production company or any of the crew members. That decision pissed off a few people, but it also relieved others. It also didn't mean that there were no consequences, because there absolutely were. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, conducted its own review and cited the production for safety violations. The initial fine was $84,000, which was later reduced to $55,000. Brandon's mother, Linda Lee Caldwell, filed a civil lawsuit against the filmmakers later that year. The case was settled privately within months under undisclosed terms. So Linda did sue the production and they settled. And we don't know. That information is private. We don't know for how much or, what that looked like. So these findings also fueled the curse speculation. Because Bruce Lee had died young under unusual circumstances, all of a sudden now we're hearing rumors of a Lee family curse. Investigators were clear in rejecting that framing. The police report laid out a painfully mundane explanation. I don't want to say it's mundane. I think that's oversimplifying it. It just was it was shortcuts, inexperience, time pressure, and a failure to follow established rules. There's nothing supernatural about this. Nothing intentional, I would say. Just a chain of small errors that no one thought would matter until they did, So I'm just going to talk about this a little bit. I don't want to give too much credence to it, but I did keep coming across this. So the idea of a Lee family curse didn't just pop out of nowhere. It sort of crept in over time, especially after people started lining up the details and realizing how strange the parallels were between Bruce Lee and Brandon Lee's death. So we know that Bruce passed after having a bad reaction to a painkiller, but for a lot of people, again, they didn't buy that explanation. So people started to talk, as we talked about previously. Then 20 years later, it happened again to Bruce's son. The shock of that alone is enormous, but people very quickly started noticing the echoes. Both men died young. Both were working on their fifth feature film. Neither lived to see the movie that would define them. Enter the Dragon for Bruce, The Crow for Brandon. People also pointed out that both were born in the year of the dragon, which only added fuel to the fire. Suddenly, fans weren't just talking about bad luck. They're saying this is a curse. Pop culture makes this even worse. In 1993, the biopic Dragon, the Bruce Lee story, came out. The one that Brandon had rejected the role in to play his father. But in that movie, there's a dream sequence where a dark figure that's haunting Bruce turns its attention toward a young Brandon. Recall that Brandon had been offered that role, but turned it down to make The Crow. He died just 2 months before the movie was released. For people already leaning toward the curse idea, that feels chilling. So in that movie, there's some kind of dark figure entity that's stalking Bruce, but then turns its eyes on Brandon, and people were like, oh shit. There's that part of the movie, and then 2 months before that movie comes out, Brandon is dead. So people are like, oh, holy shit. That's a coincidence. But here's the thing. The people who actually lived through all of this never bought into it. Linda Lee Caldwell, Bruce's widow and Brandon's mother, has always said there was no curse, just tragedy. Shannon Lee, Brandon's sister, has been even more direct, saying that focusing on a curse distracts from real causes and real accountability. Investigations backed them up. Bruce's death was ruled a medical reaction. Brandon's death was ruled an accident caused by safety failures. No foul play, no mysterious forces. So, after everything it had been through, The Crow finally met the world in the spring of 1994, and the release itself carried a kind of quiet weight. The film premiered in Santa Monica on May 10th, 1994, then opened wide in the United States on May 13th, 1994, which happened to be a Friday the 13th. Curse enthusiasts were surely noticing that. Dimension Films, under the Miramax umbrella, handled the distribution. Right out of the gate, this movie connected with audiences. I will say it's a good movie. You should go watch it. It opened at number 1 at the U.S. box office, playing in just over 1,500 theaters, and pulled in nearly $12 million its first weekend. By the end of its run, it had earned a little over $50 million domestically and about $94 million worldwide. I mean, considering it was like $23 million budget, that's awesome. Far beyond expectations for an R-rated gothic revenge film with such a heavy reputation attached to it. For Miramax, it was one of their biggest successes at the time. Critically, the response is really strong to this film. Reviewers kept circling back to the same things. They liked the visual style, they liked the emotional sincerity, and Brandon Lee's performance. Roger Ebert called it a stunning piece of visual storytelling and went so far as to say it was not only Brandon's best film, but stronger than any of Bruce Lee's movies. I love that he was giving him props, but that comparison to his father, I just don't think is fair. Karen James at the New York Times described it as a genre film done with care, while Rolling Stone referred to it as a feverish, dreamlike experience. Across the board, critics liked how the film blended comic book roots and that mournful tone of grief. At the same time, many critics acknowledged that Brandon's absence hung over the film. Writers like Desson Howe of The Washington Post said he seemed to haunt every frame, not in a distracting way, but in a way that deepened the experience. Others pointed out that the changes made during post-production, like the rewriting of the narration, restructuring some of the scenes, actually gave the story more focus and momentum than earlier drafts might have had. Over the years, the film's reputation does not fade. This is still a really popular movie. The Crow didn't become a nostalgic footnote. It's a cult classic. It's 100% a cult classic. The soundtrack was packed with alternative and industrial artists and became as influential as the movie itself. I love a good movie soundtrack. So visually, filmmakers drew comparisons to Ridley Scott's Blade Runner and Tim Burton's Batman, but many felt The Crow carved out its own space. The success inevitably led to attempts at continuing the franchise. There were sequels. I haven't seen any of these. There was City of Angels in 1996, and then Salvation in 2000, and Wicked Prayer in 2005, along with a short-lived television series. Then there's a 2024, I guess you'd call it a remake or reiteration, with Bill Skarsgård and FKA Twigs. Didn't see it. Didn't hear great things. None of them came close to replicating the impact of the original. Even director Alex Proyas later said that Brandon was the film, and that his presence couldn't be replaced. Over time, that idea became widely accepted. The Crow worked because of a specific moment, a specific performance, and a creative alignment that couldn't be repeated. Decades later, the movie still shows up on lists of influential films, including Empire Magazine's ranking of the 500 greatest movies of all time. It continues to be discovered by new audiences, often passed down the way cult films usually are, through recommendation rather than marketing. People don't just watch The Crow, they talk about when they first saw it, what age they were, and how it made them feel. So this movie lives on in infamy, despite the horrific tragedy surrounding it. Well, I should say tragedies, all those horrible things that happened on set. But that is my story misfits, ladies and gentlemen, everybody. That is the story of the death of Brandon Lee and the curse of the crow. I knew of this, but I didn't know to what extent this had happened. R.I.P. to Bruce Lee and Brandon Lee. And, I'm going to rewatch this weekend, I think. So if you have any thoughts about this case, or have you seen this movie, I'd love to hear from you on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, or Spotify at Horrorwood Podcast. Also, if you want to subscribe for some extra bonus content, head on over to Patreon or Apple or YouTube. You can also subscribe in them places too. And if you have a story for us, remember we've got those few prompts, shoot us an email. Send us an email at horrorwoodpodcast@gmail.com. All right, everybody, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Send Kate your well wishes. We hope she gets better soon so she can be back on, so it's not just a voice in a void talking about horror and curses. I'm gonna shut up now. All right, thank you. Bye.